So we're just also happy to be able to have this interview with Jonathan Dove. The UBC Opera Ensemble has been working on his piece, Mansfield Park. And Mansfield Park is a fascinating novel, and Jonathan has made it into a very fascinating opera. Just to let you know a little bit about him, he has had a lot of experience working in opera houses. And I was just telling him a little while ago that I feel like I know him because we use his reductions of standard operas all the time. And they are just incredibly well done, and they save the lives of so many opera programs and smaller opera companies that can't afford large orchestras but would like to do the standard works. But we're here to talk about his work, Mansfield Park. And Jonathan went to University at Cambridge and was studying composition there, and was also very involved with Blindborn and many other English companies, and a lot of touring companies as well. And Mansfield Park was commissioned from the from a society that goes to many of the wonderful mansions in England. And was this what prompted the commission to go to these mansions and tour these mansions with this particular opera?
Oh, well, no, but it was the perfect company to do it. In fact, I had the idea of a touring, or at least an opera that you would play in stately homes on a very small scale, years before the company that eventually commissioned it, which was called Heritage Opera, even existed. But there was already, I think, when I had the idea, which was 20 or 30 years before I wrote the opera, but there was already then a company that did put on, the famous operas in stately homes in, aristocratic country houses. I think usually just with piano, and probably in a marquee. And I think that was in my mind when I first read Mansfield Park. And I should say that I've read I think I probably read all of the other Jane Austen novels first. And I never thought of making an opera out of any of them. I love them. I mean, Emma particularly always makes me cry at exactly the same point. But I just I never thought it would be better if they were singing. But I did think that with Mansfield Park, something happened while I was reading it. And it was, I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that later on, but it was really to do with the reticent nature of the heroine. I think the fact that she says very little, but she feels so much, in a way seemed very good for opera, that she would sing her feelings, even though she couldn't say them in literal speech. So this idea came to me really before I was writing any operas at all myself. In the days when I was still a rehearsal pianist, and at Glyndebourne I was assistant chorus master. So I was working in opera houses, and you mentioned the arrangements that I made for a touring opera company of some very well-known masterpieces of the operatic repertoire, which I arranged for a little chamber orchestra. But I don't think I'd written any operas, and I didn't really know how to begin at that point. I just knew that I could just imagine this event where you would go into a stately home and you would sit in the drawing room, and then suddenly somebody next to you would start singing, and the story would happen. And before you'd even realize that there was an opera going on. So that was the idea, that it would be on this very domestic scale. I mean, a really genuinely a chamber piece that you could play in a chamber. And so the first version of the opera, when I eventually wrote it, was with just piano accompaniment. And it was a piano, 4 hands on one piano, which again, it's a scene that you quite often see in adaptations of Jane Austen. The likely couple, perhaps, at the keyboard playing a duet. And I thought, well, this is a sound world that Jane Austen would recognize. Right. Later on, I made a version for chamber orchestra, and Is that which are you using the one with chamber orchestra?
No, we're not allowed to have orchestra yet.
Yeah,
So,
so it's perfect to have the original version
right. But
exactly
we
at this
can't
moment.
have two people at one piano either. So we have
You have to have two pianos.
9-foot grands.
Yes.
Two pianists are playing. And
Well,
apropos of
enough.
that,
Yeah.
I mean, your piano writing is just incredible. It is so fascinating and so rich, and it sounds incredibly beautiful. And I'm
And
very curious about the orchestration. That was what I intended to do, but we're not allowed to have orchestra yet.
well, the version with just piano, I think, works perfectly in spaces up to maybe 200 seats. And the first places it performed were smaller than that. I mean, because it was performed in stately homes and country houses by this company, Heritage Opera, and there would be audiences of perhaps 100. And with the voices, you have all of the sustained sound, and then the piano provides the variety of texture underneath. So I always found it very satisfying. But when I saw the opera in a larger space, where there was an auditorium for about 500 people, I thought, well, it feels a little bit remote. And so in a bigger theatre, I felt that you needed a bit more orchestral support.
Yes.
And so I made a version for 13 instruments, which was first done in a small country house opera, not the size of Glyndebourne, but I think 500 or 600 seat theatre, and that was perfect there. But it's still light enough as an orchestra that you can sing quite intimately, and you can still hear all of the detail of the text, because it's a piece in which the words are very, very important. And
Very.
because, and indeed, some of them are by Jane Austen.
Yes, yes. And it's always fun when you hear those lines with Jane Austen, quoting Jane Austen, and it, it's our theater is 1,200 seats actually, but we're so fortunate because acoustically, I think it's one of the most perfect halls I've ever been in, and so the the pianos really fill the theater as well, and of course they're two 9-foot Steinways, so they're really uh, filling the hall. I was amazed too because I wondered how will this go in this big theater. Of course, we don't have an audience because of COVID, but it seems to be working very well. And the pianists are just in heaven playing those. It's very hard, they say sometimes, but that's their job, right? But they're really, really enjoying it. And so are the students enjoying singing your music. You have such a feeling for, like you were talking about Fanny and how she sings so much of the emotions but says very little actual speaking. And it's the music, I find, is the students are finding it just wonderful to be able to sing, particularly in those moments when Fanny and Edmund are speaking, and in the letter scene. I find that letter scene so amazing. I'm curious how you and the librettist just came to this sort of condensing this mammoth novel.
Well, it certainly didn't write itself, and it needed some thought. But I suppose there was always the idea that the storyline is a kind of a variation, if you like, on the old story of Cinderella.
Yes.
The poor relation, the poor, who and her two, in this case, not ugly sisters, but rather noisy sisters, and perhaps demanding, and. In fact, the sort of mother figure is very sweet, but there's also Aunt Norris, who is a sort of scolding stepmother kind of character. And so thinking of it as Cinderella, you think, well, you know that you can tell the story of Cinderella in an evening because Rossini did that very well. So that was a way of thinking about it. I suppose there were certainly decisions that had to be made about things to leave out, and Alasdair Middleton, who wrote the libretto, simply decided to leave out Portsmouth, where the story in a way begins. But we'd say when we meet Fanny, she's already arrived at Mansfield Park, and we learn about her history, I mean, very lightly sketched in, but we understand her status in the family and how she's arrived there. And the letter scene that you mentioned actually occurs in part of the book where she goes back to Portsmouth. She's sent back, and that scene, I think, is a brilliant creation by Alasdair. It compresses many different narrative strands in the book into a single scene. It's a very compelling. There was another, I suppose, significant decision that Alistair made. Particularly, we were talking about the question of formality. I suppose it's to do with a sense of behaviour that is appropriate for the period, and something that dissatisfied both of us in some television and film adaptations that we'd seen of Mansfield Park was that they often seemed to behave in a very modern way, that they were physically intimate or at ease with each other to an extent that we know wasn't the case in Jane Austen's time. And the character, Fanny Price, is sometimes depicted as rather pert and witty, and quite a long way. I mean, much more like the character of Elizabeth Bennet, for example, a different Jane Austen heroine. So, I mean, I thought it's very important, this feeling that there are restraints, that there are things that can't be done and can't be said, and how might this be achieved? And part of the way that we thought about this, although I suppose it's a musical and a dramatic approach, and Alistair's idea was to create a kind of framing device, so that rather than having a continuous flow of action, as you might expect in a 19th century opera, there would be, each scene would be set apart from the next with a chapter heading. So there's obviously a reference to the novel, but it means that you don't have to necessarily tell all the bits of story in between the crucial scenes, but it also creates a slight air of detachment, which I found very helpful in that, creating some feeling of a sort of manners of the period. And at the same time, there's a sort of musical manners, which is that I chose to only use harmonies that Jane Austen could have heard. She wouldn't have heard them in exactly the way that I use them. So I'm using, if you like, I'm using the same chords, but in a different order. And the rhythm is not, is my own and is more of our time. But the sort of harmonic restraint, I think, again, also helps to locate us in a time where behaviour is just that bit different. Having said all that, of course, people don't change so much. So outward manifestations of behaviour may change, but the human heart and the human soul are still recognizable.
We just talked last night in rehearsal about the chapters and why that was. So I'll be able to tell them today why that was. And it does do exactly that, for sure. And of course, we can't get too close because we have to be 3 meters apart. All of the furniture has to be 3 meters apart. The characters have to be 3 meters apart, and everything has to be 3 meters apart. So we are going to be very distanced and very proper. No passionate scenes, not allowed.
So you're making a virtue of necessity.
That's right. And we may have to sing with masks. We hope that we can sing without them.
But that would be quite tough.
Yeah.
Because lip reading is very important in opera, I think.
Yes, yes, exactly. But we're going to find out soon. But we hope that we can sing without masks. Also, as you say, the text is so rich, and it's very hard with masks to get all of that text. As we would like to have it. But what you were talking about Fanny, and as you say in the film, sometimes Fanny is played very pert and sometimes really kind of saucy almost. In that latest film of Mansfield Park, which is very, very good film. And then also we have no Tom, who seems to be prominent in a lot of films, but there's no older brother Tom in this one. And so you'd have to eliminate some of the characters because there were so many in
Well, in
this.
fact, yes, of course. I mean, Tom is in Antigua for quite a stretch of the novel, and so he doesn't really have anything like as significant a dramatic role. I think um, for film adaptations that want to deal more explicitly with questions of empire,
Yes,
then
yeah,
showing what a plantation is really like and the consequences of that aspect of British history, that's very helpful. But in terms of the actual the mechanism of the plot, um, the second brother is much more important because he's effectively the hero of
right.
the novel. He is the or the Prince Charming in the Cinderella.
Yes, yes,
So we need him more, I think.
right. Um, so you have been so successful. You've been one of the composers of our contemporary times that have, you've written so many operas and they're performed throughout Europe and in Asia. And I know that in the United States they perform I think Mansfield Park it was too, wasn't it, in Minnesota?
Mansfield Park has been done in a few places. In fact, I think the first American production was in Baltimore at the Peabody Institute,
Institute,
and
right, that's right.
in
Yeah,
Indianapolis also did a production.
yes.
Um, and
University of Toronto did one last year.
yes, that was an amazing production. Tim Albury directed, really beautiful, spectacular, and fascinating.
Yes,
I saw it on video. That
right.
I was really thrilled with that. Um, yes, Flight was is the opera of mine that's been probably
Yes.
most has had the most productions, and
Yeah.
that has had quite a few in the States.
And we
Uh,
just had it in Victoria with the Pacific Opera last year. And
yes, that was a wonderful production also, and I'm so glad I came. It was the last thing I saw before lockdown, uh,
yes,
and so very lucky that was a narrow escape. Um, and it was a wonderful production and a wonderful experience with that audience. And I don't know whether there's a subtle difference really between I'm sure there are many subtle cultural differences between Canada and America and I mean and the United States. Um, and I felt that the comedy in Flight it landed with the audience in Victoria in a way that I'd not experienced in many places. Um, Having said that, actually, in the Opera Theatre of St. Louis did a production with Colin Graham, which did have the audience in stitches. I mean, it was hysterical, and that's partly because the theatre there, the orchestra is very well hidden under the stage, which means that the singers never really have to fight to be heard, and so the audience gets more of the dialogue, I mean, more of the text than they often can, and so they were very very involved with the story, and that was very exciting.
but
But
Colin is
certainly the
such a
production
wonderful,
in Victoria was a very satisfying, a very rewarding experience.
yes. And I've heard so many wonderful things about that production as well. Um, so when I was telling people we were going to do your Mansfield Park, they were very, very thrilled because they had seen the flight. So they were really thrilled with that. Um, I love the story about your experience in The Adventures of Pinocchio when you were standing outside the theater and the little boy came out and um, said to his father, "Oh, Daddy, that was so good. When are we going to the next opera?" W-
Yes, I thought my work here is done. Mission accomplished. Because I did think, when I first had the idea of making an opera out of Pinocchio, I wasn't thinking about the children. I was just thinking about me. I just thought I would like to see this. I would like to see this show, and that's really the only reason for writing a piece of music is to write something you want to hear, and writing a piece for theatre is to write something you want to go to.
Right,
So that is where it started. But then I quite quickly it dawned on me that this, just the name Pinocchio would draw, many people, and that it would probably be the very first opera that a lot of children would see. And that also made me think how strange that there's a really very little repertoire that is operatic repertoire that's conceived for the whole family. People are very likely to have seen Hansel and Gretel, and then after that, we're a bit stuck.
Yes.
I mean, I've seen children at performances of The Cunning Little Vixen and really enjoying it, but it's not really an opera aimed at children, although it does have some children performers in it.
Right.
I've seen children also productions of The Magic Flute, but as you know, that can be quite a baffling experience. So, thrilling though the music is. So I thought, well, there's actually, if children don't discover when they're young that the opera house is an exciting place to be, I wonder when they will discover it. And I thought this would be worth doing,
Yes.
just so that they think, oh, actually, I see the opera can be exciting. It isn't only in a foreign language, and it isn't only set in periods which we don't understand so well, where everyone is wearing wigs. It doesn't have to be that remote. Operas can be about things happening right now, today, as I showed in my opera Flight,
Yes.
which was inspired by a true story that was still unfolding at that time. Actually, the refugee was still living in Charles de Gaulle Airport when we wrote Flight, and so that was a absolutely contemporary event. But also, I mean, Pinocchio, I think, is about it's telling a story that people are interested in, and of course, there's a nice bonus with Pinocchio in that it's a story that's known worldwide. In Europe, in mainland Europe, and especially in Italy, of course, it's best known in the form of the original book, which is a substantial book. I mean, I can't remember, 56 chapters. There's a lot of episodes in this original book. And I grew up with a version of it. Must have been very compressed, but it had most of the crucial scenes in it and very vivid pictures, which always stuck in my mind. And that was part of how I ended up thinking about it for an opera. It's very different from the story that Disney told. But in America, in North America generally, and indeed in England, I would say probably, people are more likely to have come across the Disney film than to have read the book.
Yes.
So they're in for some surprises. They go to the opera thinking they know what the story is, and then it's a lot darker. Pinocchio nearly dies 5 times, and he is left hanging from a tree, which, when Collodi wrote the book originally, that was actually where the book finished. And it was by popular demand that he brought Pinocchio back to life and finished the story in the way that we now know it. And the cricket, who's known, the Disney audiences know him as Jiminy Cricket, and he's got a song that is used as a signature tune on all Disney films still, I think, When You Wish Upon a Star. But in the book, the cricket is squished shortly after his first appearance, and indeed the first scene of the opera, Pinocchio throws a mallet at him and he's flattened against a wall. His ghost comes back later on, and then later on again he appears mysteriously, because there's a kind of dreamlike logic to some of the some of the book. So it was great fun to imagine that and to think, oh, this will be the first time children experience opera. And I make sure that I have as many different operatic voices in it as possible. So that, there's a deep bass, and there's a very spectacular coloratura soprano part. There's a countertenor. There's a little bit of everything, and a chorus.
Our head coach talked to me about the opera, and I said, "Oh, that would be great children's opera." He said, "Well, actually, it's just such a wonderful opera. I love it myself. I would like to go to it if I was an adult too." So it's interesting that you say that right off the bat. Getting back to Mansfield Park, when I was doing this, of course, we're in this, as I say, the Chance Center, and it's a very wide stage, thank goodness, because we go from one side of the stage to the other with our 3-meter distance rules. And we also can't change, we have to try and avoid anybody going into anyone else's airstreams, right, from singing. So we have to have a time when it settles and before I can move people around. So it's been a little challenging. And So it's a very wide, it's a huge living room. It's a huge wide room, right? The biggest one I've ever been in. Um, and there's only a one really one page of music where one would say it's a scene change. So you just kept it going right through, right? And when I originally planned it, I was thinking I was doing in our smaller theater, which is about 500 seats, and we have a fly system. But where we are now, it's not a fly system there. So
Uh-huh.
it's a concert stage with an opera pit. Beautiful acoustics, but no fly system. So that's been challenging. But one of my puzzles was to get this park scene, in Southerton, to go from the drawing room into the park scene. And I love that scene. I was talking to two professors about the novel from here. They've both done their research on Mansfield Park, some of it. And I said one of my favorite scenes of the opera is the scene at the gate when Rushworth comes back and
Yes.
finds that Maria has gone without him. And I find that scene so moving. He's kind of a funny character, and Tom Edmund and Sir Thomas say, if he wasn't so rich, he'd be quite stupid. Which is that's a very funny line, but and he's sort of portrayed with that, but you make the humanity of that man come out. I always find it so moving. Yeah,
Yes, I think of course his feelings are genuine. He's
yes,
genuinely
yes.
in love, but unfortunately, the person he's in love with is more aware of his money than.
12,000 a year,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
She's excited by that, but
The gate is, of course, a very graphic
yeah,
demonstration of the formality, the boundaries we were talking about earlier on. The restraint, and in fact, somebody says it gives me a feeling of restraint about the gate, um, and and there's a clear division between the characters who are prepared to go through the gate or get round the gate,
right.
and the only character, which is Fanny, who remains on the right side of the gate, and I suppose that's something that's very important in the narrative is that pretty much everyone except Fanny behaves badly
Yes,
and without a very secure moral compass. And Fanny alone has that, or listens to her because she talks about. She says we have all within ourselves a better guide if we would attend to it
thank
than
you.
any other person can be.
Yes,
Um, and that, in a way, that is the sort of the heart of the novel, or certainly the heart of her character. And she is the only one who we see actually listening to that better guide within herself.
yes. And it's been a bit of a debate about Henry and his feeling for Fanny. I mean, he's just after one woman after the other, um, making overtures to everybody. But when she rejects him, uh, the, it seems to be a real shock for him. And then in the letter scene, how do you see that letter scene with him, what he's writing to Fanny?
Yes. Well, starting with the first point, I think the thing about Henry is that he's not an out and out baddie. He's probably not very used to people rejecting him, and has probably generally not been rejected, and so that's part of the surprise. But actually, there isn't time in the opera to see everything you see in the book. In the novel, there's a scene where he's reading. I think he's reading Shakespeare. He's certainly reading
Yes.
drama aloud, and Fanny is very persuaded by that, and
Mhm.
she feels some genuine emotion in him there. And so, although there's a calculating aspect to him, he's much more complex than that. He's not an out and out bad. You sense it actually in the right hands that perhaps Fanny could have redeemed him, except that she'd already decided. You know, her heart was already given to somebody else. It's whatever she came to think of him. Um,
And she's the only one that really sees the shallowness in Mary and Henry in a way. I mean, it could be a shallowness or just their sides of thinking, well, economically for marriage, I guess, in a way, for Mary and Henry, and the Bertrams about who could bring another fortune to the family. And it's interesting though, Sir Thomas is at first so apart from the girls, but then he comes back to Maria and tries and offers her a way out for with Rushworth, but she's so determined with that money, she rejects it, right? It's and in the novel too, so
Yes, yes, it's very hard to watch that happening, but yes, she knows enough really to know that this isn't not going to end well. but, but I suppose she kids herself,
yes, yes,
or possibly sees that there. I don't know. I mean, I don't really know what she's imagining she might be able to get away with.
yeah.
Um, but everything does catch up with her.
But I do think Henry regrets his not succeeding with Fanny.
Yes, I think he genuinely does. I start to see
Yes,
her special qualities. Um, but yes, to get too late in the day, really. And I think the thing is that the Crawfords they're very charismatic and they have great abilities and great social abilities, but also artistic. You know, Mary plays the harp and sings, and so it's a very captivating character, and Henry also, as we discussed, is accomplished. Um, so it takes something quite special to be able to see through all that.
yes,
Um, which and I don't think anyone else does. In fact, do they? I think only Fanny.
just Fanny. Because
Yeah,
even Edmund, although he resists the play at first, but when he thinks he feels he's going to save Mary by being her lover, but I think he's seduced
yes,
by her as well.
yes. He's already compromised, and in fact, there's a heartbreaking moment just before the business of the play, which is the stargazing scene, which is one of the two scenes. The wilderness scene that we've talked about a bit with the gate was one of the first ones when I read the book that I heard music, not the music in the opera, but there was just a musical feeling about it, because it was very stirring. This disturbance all around Fanny, and that she's left alone while everyone else goes off cavorting and gallivanting and up to no good in the wilderness. And then and the next scene in the opera is a scene where she and Edmund are together for the first time in ages, it seems, and looking out of the window at the stars, and she's pointing out and he's saying, "Oh, we might be able to see Cassiopeia, but if we'd have to go out onto the lawn for that." And there's this lovely feeling of, oh, at last Fanny's with her soulmate, and they're sharing some time together. But then Mary starts to play the harp and she starts to sing, and that's the end. And Edmund is irresistibly drawn like a moth to a flame, and he can't really help himself.
Yes,
So yes, I think when he says he's taking the part in order to avoid Mary Crawford being compromised, he's already lost. In fact,
he's already done for. But he too redeems himself, right? Once he sees the true, how she would try to fix the scandal with Mariah, and uh, he then comes out of it. So
yes, it's a very shocking moment. It's the penultimate scene um, where these two very different attitudes confront each other. Um, there's a scandal that's in all the newspapers, and it's completely public. That there's an elopement, and for Mary, that's just a situation to be managed.
yes,
From which recovery is perfectly possible if you throw the right dinner parties and say the right things and smile in the right places. And for Edmund, it's a complete disaster. It's absolutely appalling. And when he realizes, that's the moment where he suddenly sees the scales fall from his eyes. But it's taken most of the opera and most of the novel to get to that point.
That's right. And again, you said that so beautifully when there's that realization, and then Mary leaves, and I'm not sure how you meant the when she says Mr. Bertram, and then you have that wonderful coloratura for the Mr. Bertram. I've set it in a very defiant, sort of sexy, I'm off, and that's it for you. And she goes out, and then he closes the door, and there's a silence, and he's just there thinking, oh my God, how could I have been so stupid? His back's to the audience. No audience, but his back's to the camera. So but I find the way you said that is so perfect. It's so, again, one of the most moving scenes. And then the silence that you use there, well, it's silence at first, and then this beautiful slower music, and just the realization of what he's done. It is so truthful, I think, from that moment.
Yes, and I think we think that Mary Crawford. It's not that she suddenly sees the error of her ways. I don't
No,
think she doesn't have undergo a complete change of personality.
oh,
She just realizes that this hasn't worked out, and she will, she's not going to stay around where she's not appreciated, and she will go elsewhere. So I think indeed it may just be a see what you're missing kind of
exactly.
attitude from her.
Yeah, yeah. Because she's so clear with him. She says, I I like rich and honest people, not poor and honest people, right? In
Yes.
her text. Um,
And she does also say earlier in the ball scene that whenever it's early in the act, I have never danced with a clergyman, and I swear I never will.
that's right. That's right.
And that's where Edmund is headed. And I suppose she's perhaps also hoping that in some way he's going to come into the fortune, and it'll
Yes.
work out all
Yeah.
right.
I think she says something about you could be a lawyer too in the novel or something, instead of a parsonage, of a minister. You could be a lawyer or something. And um, it's it's so difficult for the Henrys, to figure out, I think, to accept why they are right. Like that, I feel that transition for the Henry is when I love this line where you say, the paste has gone to Brighton, the diamond remains here. And I'm wondering if that is where, do you think then that's where Henry first realizes, I've been very foolish. This is the real woman, the real woman with character, Fanny is, and the paste has gone, Mariah has gone to Brighton. And
Yes, I think he's genuinely sensed her depths.
yeah,
I mean, the
that,
Fanny's depths.
that moment, yeah. And then it goes from there. Yeah. Then the ladder comes after that.
Yes, although I mean, it is nonetheless shocking when he says, "I mean to make Fanny Price fall in love with me."
Exactly. And yes, so that those moments are we're interested in, because is he saying that he's so confident he can do that, it seems, the way that text comes out, that he
Yes,
is.
yes, you sort of feel that's not the first time he's
Yes,
made somebody fall in love with him. And even though he recognizes, I suppose, that Fanny is unusual, um, and that's now the attraction, and perhaps the fact that he perhaps also senses that she is unattainable for him, and that is what's so alluring.
yes. And so he's going to go after her because she does seem unattainable. It's a
Yeah.
challenge for his ego, I guess, maybe.
Because everyone is on his side. I mean, everyone thinks that she should
Everyone.
marry him.
Yes,
And Sir Thomas is mortified that Fanny turns him down.
yes,
In fact, everyone is horrified.
yes,
Uh, even though Mary Crawford sort of sympathizes and said, of course he's, yes, of course he's a terrible person, but he'll be as faithful to you, as nearly faithful to you as possible.
He'll be very faithful to you for a while, and then you'll just have to deal with it, and he'll mean well.
And of course, even the structure of the event allows Henry of the ball, because
Yes,
it's for Fanny. It means that she's in a way vulnerable to his advances, and that he can offer the first dance, and off it goes. Everything sort of conspires really
yes,
to give him the upper hand,
yes,
which makes it all the more impressive, really, that Fanny knows herself well enough to know that this is not a match for her.
yes. And there's such strength in, like, she is very quiet, and she does uh, let herself be ruled by these people. And as you have in the first Miss Fanny, and the poor girl going in every direction. But she has such strength when you see her as she goes along in the opera and you get to know her. Much more character and strength than the others, really. Uh,
Yes, it's no knowing where that all came from, because she's come from a deprived home life before she arrives in Mansfield Park, uh, and she's not given much attention by anyone except Edmund. You sense that Edmund has been her ally all along, and in fact, it's all kind of in a way going very well with Edmund until the Crawfords arrive, until Mary Crawford
right.
is a rival. But that's the warmest relationship, it seems, and perhaps in her growing up, Edmund has helped to develop that moral sensibility. And I suppose after Fanny, he seems to be the most moral, but just not quite moral enough.
Yes. But he redeems himself, right? He comes
Yeah.
back
Oh, completely. Yeah.
to that, and recognizes that that very moving scene, which is tremendous. So what are you looking at in the future? Are you working on some new operas that we're going to be
Yeah.
able to do?
Yes, I suppose I always feel happiest if I know that there are some operas on the horizon.
Yeah.
And at the moment, yes, I'm working on one is another opera for a family audience. So Pinocchio was actually not my first of those. There was another one, The Enchanted Pig.
Oh, yes, yes.
And there's an opera called Swan Hunter, which is sort of for young people. It's not really for children, but certainly for a younger audience, young teenagers. I'm writing an opera for Zurich, so I actually have to write this opera in German,
Ah,
and I cannot at this moment reveal what the story is. But I'm working with a German librettist who speaks very good English, so we can have very good meetings.
right.
And my German is very, very rusty. I did it to what in England we have A levels. I'm not sure what the equivalent will be over there, but anyway, the exams you do at 17 or 18. So I got up until that point. I was actually quite fluent, but I've really not used it. So that's going to be an extra challenge.
Right.
But actually, there's another opera project also for sort of a teenage audience, and another opera which is likely to involve community participation, which is something that I have. It's really where I started, actually. The first operas I wrote, which were also for Glyndebourne, like Flight, but they were community operas, which is a peculiar British institution. I think it's happening in more places now. But
It is, and I was reading about that, and it's something that in England used to be, but now is very much. There's a lot of interest, I think, by companies doing this kind of thing, and with the community groups. I'd love to hear more about that from you.
well, in fact, my most recent endeavour it was an opera it was a rather unusual commission because it was actually commissioned not by an opera company but by a symphony orchestra, or by two symphony orchestras. It was the Berlin Philharmonic and the London Symphony Orchestra. So the idea was to have an opera which you could perform in a concert hall without scenery, and with the orchestra on stage with all the performers. But it was also commissioned, so it was a co-commission with the Aix-en-Provence Festival, where it was going to have a full theatrical production, and did. And the idea was to involve children and teenagers, and I suppose the model here was Benjamin Britten's Noah's Flood, which is the most famous and the most skillful and widely performed community opera. And in that, in Britten's opera, there's a role for young children, 8 or 9, who come on as the animals getting into the ark, and they sing Kyrie, Kyrie, Kyrie eleison quite a lot, and they sing one or two other things, and then but there's a sort of young teenage audience, and older young people have the lion's share of the piece. So there's some professionals, not very many. There are some professional instrumentalists. I think it's a string quartet and an organ in the Noah's Flood, and then everything else is sort of from the community. And it's this idea of blending professionals and amateurs. It's very inspiring and enriching, I think. And so I wrote a piece, the piece that I ended up writing, also with Alistair Middleton. It's called The Monster in the Maze, and it's the story of the Minotaur. And on stage, well, in Aix-en-Provence, there were about 300 people on stage. But of those, only 4 are professional performers. There's an actor who plays the role of Minos, the king, whose decree is that the youth of Athens will be sent every year to Crete and sacrificed to the Minotaur. And then there's Theseus and his mother, and Daedalus, the man who's designed the labyrinth in which the Minotaur lives. And those are the only professional parts, and all of the rest are large choruses of 50 or 100 young people, and also adults, or adults on stage. That doesn't happen in Noah's Flood. In the Benjamin Britten, the audience is supposed to sing certain hymns. There are 4, I think, hymns throughout the opera that the audience, as a congregation, joins in with. But of course, now in many parts of the world, you cannot assume that an audience will know these hymns. And so that part of the piece is now rather difficult to achieve. So for that reason, I thought it's better to have an adult group in the piece who already know the piece, who they've already learnt it. So they're part of the production. And although I mentioned Flight, the comedy set in an airport, as my most produced opera, The Monster in the Maze is already my most translated opera. So it's been done in more different languages.
Has it been done in China as well, I think?
It was done in Taiwan, in a mixture of Taiwanese and Cantonese, neither of which I speak. But it was wonderful to have a vocal score with pictograms alongside the words that I recognize. So it was originally done in, first of all in Berlin, and then in London, and then in Aix-en-Provence. So in German and English and French. I've seen it in Portugal, in Lisbon in Portuguese, and I've seen it in Sweden in Swedish. And we were all set for, and I've seen it in Barcelona in Catalan. We were all set for a Dutch production this year, which was to have been in June last year, and of course was a casualty of COVID. Right. But I think, and there was another Barcelona production that also was cancelled. And I think the thing is that it's an opportunity for an opera company to really collaborate with the community, and for people who perhaps have not previously had an interest in opera to come and take part in an opera. Because I think obviously it's wonderful to see an opera, but I think it's even better to do it. Yes. I think the people who are doing it and making it happen actually having the best time. Yes. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to bring everyone together in that way. And I think that's why that particular piece has already, it's 5 years old, but it's already had quite a lot of outings,
Right.
which is and so I'm working on a new piece which will have a similarly large community cast as part of it. That's the plan.
Well, it's so important to engage the community so we can keep the art form and the interest going, and give people, as you say, the opportunity to be in opera, which is such a wonderful art form, really, and so thrilling when you're on stage, I think.
Yes, and I think also it's what's great is that it's great for the community performers to be alongside professional singers, and they find that very inspiring to hear someone who's trained their voice to that level and is able to produce such a huge sound and with such range and such power and emotion. But it's also wonderful for the professional singers and the professional instrumentalists to be alongside amateurs and seeing their sheer excitement at being allowed to be on stage and to be doing things that they don't normally get to do reminds the professionals of what was so thrilling for them when they started out, because you can sometimes lose sight of that a bit.
Yes.
So I think everyone wins out of that experience.
Yes. Well, it's so interesting. You've done such a breadth from this opera of 10 people to 300. It's You have a wide variety of repertoire that you've written, and
Well, I suppose it dawned on me quite early on, as a result of certainly formative experiences I had, working with a touring opera company and working with a wonderful opera director, Graham Vick, on a community opera. Well, it was a community production of West Side Story of Bernstein, in an industrial space, so not in a theatre at all.
yes,
And I realized that the operatic experience can be had outside of the mainstream opera house, and that in a way the operatic experience is too important to be just restricted to the opera house. Having said that, of course, the opera house is actually the best place for a lot of operas. The acoustics work and everything sounds wonderful there. And if you perform operas in spaces that are not designed for it, you often have to do a lot to make the space work as a theatre, and you've got to bring in all the lighting rigs, and you have to make some acoustic interventions. So there are challenges. On the other hand, you can, if you work outside of opera houses, you can often attract performers and audiences who are inhibited about, for one reason or another, because they think opera houses are not for them. They think that they're going to be bored, or they think they're going to be out of place. And indeed, some people can have off-putting first experiences of going into an opera house, and which is very regrettable.
yes,
But it's a challenge, I think, for opera companies, on the one hand, to keep a feeling of, well, to achieve excellence and to aim for the highest possible standards of performance, and to celebrate the mysteries of the art, and yet at the same time to also make it seem available and open to all. It's not impossible to do all that, but it's not easy. It's a challenge, I think.
keeps you very busy trying to do all of that, but it's very important to do it. And I kind of think after COVID, when the opera house is open, people are going to be very happy to go back in. Although some people say, oh, they'll be very cautious, but the impression I get, and I'm not sure how it is in England, but over here, people are just so eager to hear live performance again.
Yes, I mean, the live performances that we had between lockdown phases, sort of from the summer through till October, here were certainly were as well attended as they could be, given that there were so many seats that you weren't allowed to use and all of those restrictions. And actually, I mean, my own experience of performing, there's an 8-part choral ensemble called Voces 8 that I work with from time to time, who are amazing singers. And we performed together, and we were rehearsing in September. And I suppose I hadn't had anyone singing live at close quarters for so many months, that it was a really intoxicating experience. I actually felt quite drunk by the end of our rehearsal, having these amazing voices so close,
Well,
and
the
so
first
beautiful.
the first rehearsal we had in September, when we could go back and we found out we could be in person and working with each other. We'd have to wear masks, but we could be with each other and teach
Mm.
in person the lessons and everything. Everybody cried because we were just so thankful to be together again, to make music together again. And we did do one concert without masks in November, which was then another sort of uh, sigh of relief to be able to sing. But we had to do one thing on this part of the stage and the other on that. And then I had them up in the balconies, and we always were switching places. So to be very, very careful, which we are trying our best to do. So when you see our production, you're going to see a very large living room, and sometimes you wish you just long for somebody to get close, but they can't. So, but we're
But
so
that,
grateful
yeah.
to be performing your opera because it is a wonderful, wonderful opera. And the vocal writing is just stunning. Um, so you're a singer, so that makes the difference, right?
Well, I think yes. I never trained as a singer, but I do love to. I sing everything that I write, and I
Yeah.
think, well, if I can sing it, then the real professionals will surely be able to
I
sing
think
it.
then you have a very good voice because some of this stuff is pretty demanding too. It's really lovely. It really is so moving. And the ensemble work is just amazing, which of course with you write a lot of choral works too, so and symphonies and everything. So
Yes, but I think I'm lucky in that my idiom at the writing. I mean, I think most audiences would think this is tonal music, and there are certain kind of precise reasons why I think of it not exactly tonal, but more as modal. But these are
yes,
the point is that actually writing in the way that I do and with the kind of harmonies that I like to use, it's relatively easy for me to combine voices in such a way that you can hear different lines and you can hear contrasting emotions at the same time, which is one of the great glories of opera. It's one of the things that spoken theatre simply can't do.
right, right,
And so I've always loved that, the ensemble,
right,
as a great jewel of opera.
yes. And the pacing of the opera, the scenes, going right off the bat, the Mansfield Park, this wonderful sound right off the bat, and then we're going on to lovers' vows, and all of these things they're things that you just they come out and they inspire and energize. And then there's this heartbreaking moments in your opera that I look forward to to having the audience see this opera here and enjoy it. And I can tell you the students have really enjoyed working on it very, very much.
Thank you. It's lovely to hear. I'm thrilled that you're able to put it on now in this very challenging time, and I suppose I'm also glad, of course, that the very particular qualities of the piece lend themselves to a distanced and safe performance. So that's a lucky and very unexpected bonus of this piece.
We certainly won't have an overly passionate, improper moments there. It'll be very Jane Austen period.
I'm thrilled to hear it.
So, Jonathan, thank you so much for all your time. And I know once I get off this interview, I'll have a million questions, and I'm sure my students will say, "Why didn't you ask him about this or this?" Um, but I hope that we will be able to get back together again and that we can have a lot more discussion about future operas of yours. And
Well,
um,
I'd love that, and I'd also, of course, love to be able to see in some way online this
oh,
production.
we will send you a link. We will
Yeah,
send
when is opening night or opening day?
on next Saturday. It's Saturday evening at 7 and then Sunday at 2 because we have two casts. of the opera.
Yes, wonderful. Well, toi to all the performers.
Well, thank you very much, and we feel very privileged to be able to do this. And I wish you all the best. I hope you stay safe and that we all get through this very quickly and
Yeah,
get back to normal life and be able to
thank
enjoy
you.
more and more of your operas.
Thank you very much. It was lovely talking to you.
Likewise. Thank
Right.
you very much. Bye
Okay.
bye.